So as Anne-Marie said, today I'm presenting this presentation, the first one on behalf of Barbara Shilarova, who unfortunately can't be with us. And the two of us worked on a project along with colleagues, Anne-Marie Towers and also Karen Jones, looking at enhancing our understanding of measuring social care related quality of life of people with dementia who are unable to self-report. And this project was funded by Research for Social Care. And because of that, the usual disclaimer before we begin the presentation. So the background to the projects, one of the trends that we're seeing is that people with dementia are not only an increasing group of people, but people living with dementia living at home in their own homes or with family is a growing group of people. In the UK, it represents the majority, estimated at around 61% of people. Some estimates have that slightly higher. And in terms of the qualitative evidence, there's also evidence that people prefer to stay at home and to live independently and to live well for as long as they can. So because of that, one of the things that we know, I think all of us here from our work, is the importance of what we call community-based support, social care services, things like home care, or other support services, things like day activities, meals services, and a whole range of other things that help people to stay connected with their community and to meet their needs, are really vital for this group of people, helping them to live independently and also helping family and friend carers who are around supporting as well. And one of the things that we've noticed in our work, particularly the ASCOT work, is the challenge of collecting information from this group of people. And in some of the other presentations that I'm sure will come in the next few months, we've had a range of different approaches to this. But this project that I'll be presenting on is one of the projects which presents one way of trying to solve the problem of how to collect quality of life information from people with dementia who have memory or communication difficulties that make it difficult for them to fill in a questionnaire, a self-report form. And a little bit of background to this project. The idea has been around for a while, and this work represents the continuation of a series of research studies that go back a few years, which actually a number of people on this call have been involved in. So I won't try to name all of them because I may end up missing somebody off, but there's a whole team of people and a lot of research that has gone into the background. And what we have is a version of the ASCOT questionnaire called the ASCOT proxy. And this has been developed to be completed by someone on behalf of the person with dementia. And it represents the same areas of quality of life as the other ASCOT tools. So this picture shows those. There are 8 areas, things like personal cleanliness and comfort, food and drink, safety, cleanliness of the home and comfort of the home, social participation and involvement, control over daily living, occupation, which is not to do with work, but doing things that you value and enjoy, and also dignity. So those 8 areas are the same as other ASCOT tools which are designed for people who are using social care services. And to give you an idea of what the tool looks like, this is one of the questions from the ASCOT proxy. And like the other ASCOT questions, there's one question for each of those 8 areas, each of these 8 areas which I showed earlier. But this slide will hopefully give you an idea of what's different. So this is about food and drink, and the question is, thinking about the food and drink the person you represent gets, which of the following statements best describes his or her situation? And then there's an explanation. So what do you think in the first column? And then the second column is how you think the person you are representing would answer. And you can see then down here, you've got 4 statements and 4 boxes with the 2 columns. And the first statement represents the ideal state, so that things are as the person wants and prefers. The second response represents no need, so getting adequate food and drink at okay times. The third statement down is some needs, so doesn't always get adequate or timely food and drink. And the bottom statement represents high level needs, so they don't always get adequate or timely food and drink, and there is a risk to health. Now, these questions didn't just emerge from anywhere. We had the original version of ASCOT, which is, as we're celebrating now, over 10 years or just over 10 years old. So we had that as a starting point. We also, in the early work, colleagues, we did literature review, we did focus groups with people who might be proxy respondents, so care workers, family members. And we also went out and tested, we developed sort of draft questions, and we went out and interviewed people using those questions to try and work out whether the questions were clear, understandable, easy to respond to. Was there anything that was confusing? And that's where this question and the particular layout that we're using came from. And one of the clear things that came from that work is that if you ask people to give a proxy response on behalf of someone, quite often what the proxy's opinion is, so what they think, is quite often different from what they think the person thinks. So we've got food and drink here. So to give an example, you can imagine perhaps a husband answering on behalf of his wife, and he might say, well, I think it's okay, it's adequate, gets adequate food and drink at okay times, but she thinks that she doesn't always get adequate or timely food and drink because she really likes this one particular kind of food, but I know it's not very good for her and I don't want to sort of provide that at every meal time. So there's a difference of opinion, a difference in perspective. And by having these two columns, these two different views, that enables people to express those differences. And this is based on work that goes back, it was published in 2005, Pickard and Knight developed this idea of having two different proxy views, and that they actually recommend that proxy report instruments either explicitly use one view or the other, or collect both of them. So we're drawing on that work. And this is an approach that you see also in other outcome measures. And we found that by giving people the ability to have the two columns, it helps them to feel confident and comfortable with giving a response. So in terms of the work I'm presenting today, the project, which actually finished last year, was 2 years long. And one of the aims was to take the ASCOT proxy, which we'd developed, and to actually then test it out and to try and understand whether it's feasible to collect data about people with dementia's quality of life using it, and whether it measures what it's intended to measure, so whether it's valid, and also whether it's reliable, internally consistent. So that was the aim of this piece of work. And we did that by a survey of family members or friends of someone living with dementia. And for the study, we had certain inclusion criteria. So we only included people with dementia who were living at home, so not in residential or nursing care, people who were receiving at least one kind of community social care service, and also those people who wouldn't be able to answer a postal or online questionnaire even with help. And to make sure that we were getting the right kind of people, we actually mocked up one of the usual ASCOT questions. And as one of the screening parts of the study, we did ask, well, would the person be able to complete this question? And if the answer was yes, then they were not eligible for this study, because in our broader set of work, we've got other methods that might be appropriate. And we're really wanting, with this particular tool, to focus on people who wouldn't be able to self-report even with other kinds of help. And we got pretty good response to the survey. We wanted to recruit at least 300 people. We got 313 family carers. And this slide gives a little bit of the characteristics. So the average age was 62 years. We had a majority of women, which is quite common in this kind of research. We also had quite a good proportion of the study who were providing very intensive care. So 47% were providing 50 or more hours of care per week, and 14% having provided care for at least 10 years. And again, characteristics of the person living with dementia. I think a key thing here is that most were partners or spouses or parents, and nearly 58% were living in the same household. So that gives a little bit of an idea. And the box at the bottom also gives a bit of a split. So what we ended up doing was we originally wanted to do exactly half and half postal and half online, so we could look at differences of response. The pandemic slightly got in the way of the data collection, so we didn't quite get half and half. We ended up with far more online responses because we were actually doing data collection during some periods where that was just not possible, but still got 63 responses by postal questionnaire. And also you can see there the two columns for recruitment, JDR and NHS. So to explain that, some of the sample was recruited through a volunteer panel called Join Dementia Research, and the rest of the sample were actually recruited through NHS sites who kindly provided support for this study. So in terms of the results, so we collected data using the ASCOT proxy, ASCOT proxy using this questionnaire. And as I mentioned earlier, for each question, you have these two columns. You have what the proxy thinks. So in this diagram, that's called the proxy or P proxy response. And then you also have what the proxy thinks the person thinks. So that in this diagram is called P patient, which is the terminology that was used in that paper I mentioned by Pickard and Knight. You'll see in some of the later slides, we've adapted that because I don't think patient quite fits for social care. So we call it instead proxy person or proxy patient. That gives the two different proxy views. And what you can see here is, and perhaps as we'd actually expect, that you don't get complete correspondence between those two different proxy perspectives. People do rate them slightly differently. This is something that's been replicated in other instruments that have used these two approaches, and it was also what was anticipated theoretically originally. So we've also found that with the ASCOT proxy. And I think it's really important to say that we don't see this as a problem. We see proxy response as different from self-report. So you can't think of them as equivalent. And you can also think of these two different proxy perspectives as distinct pieces of information as well, because they're capturing slightly different things. They're capturing either a person's view of the person with dementia, or you're capturing that person's trying to get empathetically into the person with dementia's perspective and rating. And they will give slightly different answers to the two. And again, that's what we found, and I think is important to recognise for anyone thinking of using this instrument. We also looked at the distribution of responses, and what we found is that they're skewed, which matches also other ASCOT tools. So people tend to rate more on the positive side of things. And you can see that for both of the instruments, they're kind of roughly following that pattern, but you get slightly higher ratings for the proxy person or proxy patient than you do for the proxy. So that's saying what the proxy thinks the person with dementia thinks is rated as better or higher quality of life than what the proxy thinks. And again, that is a difference that we would expect to see. We found it, and again, it's really important for people perhaps picking up the instrument and thinking about using it to get very clearly conceptually that these are two different perspectives that capture slightly different things. So in terms of trying to answer some of the questions that we set at the beginning of the study, the first one was whether the ASCOT proxy is a feasible questionnaire or a feasible way of collecting information, whether it's acceptable to people. And one way of assessing this is by looking at how much missing data there is. So clearly with a postal questionnaire, people could and did choose to skip out questions. And when we set up the online questionnaire using Qualtrics, we were also very careful to allow people to say, actually, I choose not to answer this question. So if someone just skipped by accident, a little box came up and it said, are you sure you want to skip this question? And if they clicked yes, then that went in as a missing response. And again, reassuringly, like with the other ASCOT tools, we found generally the missing values were quite low. So you can see some of the numbers here. So for most of the domains, you're looking at, maximum of 5 or 6 out of 313. The exception was the dignity domain. So the dignity domain asks about paid support and whether the paid support, for example, home care or other support, whether the people involved treat the person with dignity and respect. And what we found in the initial testing of that question is that this can be really quite difficult for proxies to reply to. Particularly when they're giving the proxy version, because they're having to do quite a lot of mental gymnastics to get into the person's frame of mind, to think about, what their perceptions might be, and so on. But even so, the majority of people were able to respond, and we're looking at maybe 21 or 22 missing values out of 313. So it was not too bad. The next thing we looked at was internal consistency or reliability. And this is looking at the items and seeing how consistent they are with one another. And what we found was that for both of the proxy perspectives, we had an alpha coefficient of greater than 0.7, which is the standard used. So again, that gives us a little bit of confidence in thinking that this measure is internally consistent and reliable. The next thing that we did was look at what we call construct validity. So this is asking the question is, does this measure capture what we think it's measuring? So with ASCOT, including the ASCOT proxy, we're trying to capture social care related quality of life. We've got a lot of data from the other ASCOT instruments knowing that it has good validity. And what we were trying to do is to replicate that with the ASCOT proxy. So in the blue box, we can see what we call convergent validity. So we know with other versions of ASCOT that there's a relationship with related measures like the EQ5D, which is different but has some similarities. We would also expect there to be some similarities with measures of dementia quality of life, like the DEMQual, and also looking at overall ratings of quality of life. And also, we'd expect some relationships also with certain socio-demographic variables and also activities of daily living. So higher activities, difficulty with activities of daily living is generally related to lower social care related quality of life. So drawing on previous, we came with hypotheses and then we tested them. And what we found is that overall, most of these hypotheses were valid, were as we expected them to be in the data. And one interesting thing is that talking about these proxy perspectives, we generally found alignment. So the ASCOT proxy and the other instruments proxy were closer than the other proxy perspective. So again, we're finding that, there's the kinds of relationships that we'd expect to see. And in the green box, it's similar idea, something called known groups validity, which is where you're looking based on previous evidence, where there are group differences. We know that people who say that their home is not suitable to their needs tend to have lower social care related quality of life, and we found that in various different groups using other ASCOT instruments. And again, we tested that with the ASCOT proxy, and again what we found was what was expected, and that adds to the evidence that the ASCOT proxy is a valid instrument of social care related quality of life. So the final thing that we did in terms of looking at the ASCOT proxy is each time, so in this study, what we were doing was taking the ASCOT questionnaire, the original one, through the previous work, it's been adapted to proxy reports, and then we've got some data using that. And one way of checking back when you adapt a measure, whether that's by translating it or making a slightly different version, is by looking at what we call structural validity. So what we know is that with the original ASCOT, those 8 questions come together as a single scale. So those 8 different items, when we look at them, they come together as a single measure. And with other versions, translations, adapted versions of the ASCOT, we know that that still holds, so that we can take those 8 items, bring them together, and then we've got a scale. And what we wanted to know is, does that also hold for the ASCOT proxy? And we've basically got 2 measures, because we've got the ratings proxy as well as proxy person. And the answer was a bit more complicated than we were expecting. So what we found is that the single scale was there for the ASCOT proxy person. So where you're asking the proxy respondent to answer taking the person's perspective, then it functions in the same way. But for the proxy, what we actually found was that the scale splits into 2. And in this diagram, you can see hopefully some blue with a label factor 1 and factor 2. And what we found is that the 4 items at the top, factor 1, so personal cleanliness and comfort, food and drink, safety and clean and comfortable accommodation, formed together 1 factor. And then at the bottom, social participation, control and occupation formed a different factor. And actually dignity didn't quite fit in to either of those. So this is different from the other ASCOT measures, but interestingly, does align with some of the ways in which we have in the past and also still now thought about ASCOT in terms of it capturing both basic domains of social care related quality of life, but also what we call higher order domains. And with dignity perhaps being a little unusual because it's the only question that assumes you're receiving paid support. All of the other domains could be answered by absolutely anybody in that they would make sense. So at the moment, we're left with a bit of a question around this. What does this mean? Well, I think it tells us that we can take the proxy person perspective and have some confidence that it works as a measure in the same way as the other ASCOT measures. But for the proxy, I think we need to do a little bit more investigation and a bit more work to think that through, particularly in using this as it's applied in research studies and in other ways. So just as a summary, so from this study, we have some initial evidence that the measure is feasible, valid and reliable as a measure of social care related quality of life. We know that there's a difference between the proxy report perspectives, and this isn't a problem, it's as we'd expect, but we've got some evidence as to those differences. How do they work differently? And we've also got some idea of structural validity. But I think, as I said earlier, we do need to do a bit more testing around that to really understand, particularly in terms of implications of how the measure's used in, for example, evaluation studies. And also the final thing is we'd originally with this study wanted to also look at retest reliability, which is where you look at changes over a short period of time. And unfortunately, because we were doing data collection during the pandemic, we were not able to do what we'd originally set out to do. So that's still a question mark, and hopefully will be picked up in another study and another data collection to fill in the gap. And just then to acknowledge the wider team. So as I said earlier, I'm actually presenting on behalf of Barbara Schillerova, and recognising our other colleagues, Karen Jones, Anne-Marie Towers, myself, and our two research advisors, Della and Acta, who were very much part of the team and supporting and advising on the way. So thank you very much. So this second paper actually draws on exactly the same study, but is actually taking slightly different angle. So again, same team and same disclaimer. And again, the background, as I set out in the previous presentation, is thinking around people living with dementia in their own homes, the role of social care support to help them, but also their family carers. And here looking and thinking around the Care Act in England, which has this dual focus both on people with support needs and their family carers, and the way in which the social care system, social care support helps individuals, but also carers and the people with care needs together. And again, exactly the same context as before, that this group is often overlooked and excluded from data collections. And that includes things like the Adult Social Care Survey in England, which again is a self-report survey, so means that certain people may not be able to participate. And here I'm just setting out the aims of the overall study. So aim number one was the aim that was addressed in the first paper that I gave on behalf of Barbara. The second aim is actually not covered by either of the papers today, but was a important aim looking at the other ASCOT measure that we applied in this study, the ASCOT carer. And the third aim is what we'll be focusing on here. And that aim was to look at the factors associated with social care related quality of life, both for people with dementia using the ASCOT proxy measure, and also the social care related quality of life of family carers, so their own quality of life using the ASCOT carer, and that not being proxy reported, but the carers reporting about their own quality of life. And again, just a quick recap of the methods, it was a survey of carers of people living with dementia, and it was a dual online and postal questionnaire. And we collected a whole range of different data, including personal characteristics of both the carer and the care recipients, data around the caregiving situation, also some information around what community-based services were used, the intensity of use, and also satisfaction with those services, and a number of outcome measures, including the ASCOT carer and the ASCOT proxy. So I'm going to skip over this because I explained earlier about the ASCOT proxy, but we also collected data from the ASCOT carer. So I talked earlier about ASCOT having 8 domains. That's the version that's for service users or people using social care. But we have a slightly different version for carers, which has 7 domains, some of which overlap. So some of these will look familiar. For example, control over daily life, relationships with family and friends or social participation, occupation, doing things I value and enjoy, and personal safety. So those top 4 overlap. But the bottom 3 are either adapted domains or new ones that are just for carers. So feeling supported and encouraged in the caring role. So do family carers feel supported? What we call self-care. So is the carer able to eat well? Are they getting enough sleep? Are they able to get to medical appointments? All things that we know are really important for family carers, particularly those who are giving really intense support to the person, to their loved one. And also time and space to be myself. Again, this is really important to family carers when we talk to them, having some space to step away from the caring role and to be able to reconnect with themselves, their sense of identity. And again, some people say, oh, is that not similar to the other domains? In the work that we've done, we've actually found that this 7th domain is separate and is identified as something important to carers. So we've retained it in the final version of the questionnaire. Now, one of the things I briefly mentioned, but I think here is worth a bit more time, was that all of the data collection, in fact, the whole study took place during the COVID pandemic, including the very early stages. So I've tried here to capture in a diagram what was going on during the time that we were collecting data. And we actually started collection in January 2020. So we had a little bit of time before any of the restrictions. So that on the left-hand side, that first box. But after that, if you can think back, it may seem a very long time ago, we went through a number of phases of different policy in England related to COVID, including national lockdowns, periods of lesser restrictions, regional tier systems, more lockdowns, then reintroducing the tier system, another lockdown, and then an easing of restrictions. And that took us to the end of data collection, which was in the following April 2021. And again, as I mentioned in the previous one, the inclusion criteria, we wanted to collect data from family or friends of someone living with dementia who is providing care for them. The person was someone living at home using a social care service or more than one, and someone who wouldn't be able to answer a questionnaire even with help. And in terms of this particular study, we took a different approach to looking at the data. So what I'm showing here is for the 3 questionnaires or the 3 social care related quality of life measures that we collected. So you've got the ASCOT carer and then the 2 proxy perspectives. And what we did was for each question, you have the 4 response options, and the bottom 2 relate to unmet needs. So what we did was we collapsed those 2 together to give us an indicator, a binary indicator of whether someone had no needs or no unmet needs or unmet needs. And then here in this table, you can see that presented as a percentage. And the thing that jumps out immediately looking at the ASCOT carer is that in bold, you've got over 50% of people reporting unmet needs in those 5 areas: control over daily life, occupation, social participation, time and space, and feeling supported and encouraged. For self-care, that's 32%. The only one that's under 5% is personal safety. So that's, I think, an initial headline that's actually quite stark, is that this questionnaire, looking at carers of people with dementia living in their own homes, there's a profile of quite significant unmet need. And again, we did exactly the same for the person with dementia proxy reported through the 2 different perspectives. And you can see here that that's a slightly different profile. There are 3 domains where there are high unmet needs, over 50%. But these correspond to the, as I mentioned earlier, the higher order domains: control, social participation, and occupation. And also you can get a very quick feel of the differences between the proxy perspectives. So say, for example, food and drink, you can see that the proxy rating of unmet needs for food and drink at 15% is higher than proxy person. I think the example that we mentioned in the questions, does hint us to some of as to why there are some of those differences, but you can see similar in the other domains. And so what we wanted to then look at was the factors related to social care related quality of life. So this table, we're looking at the ASCOT carer and looking at overall social care related quality of life. And then what we did was we looked at a number of different factors. So things like gender, age, ethnicity, self-rated help, but also looking at factors to do with the caring situation. So whether the carer and the person with dementia live together, the cognitive impairment, number of hours that the family carer was providing per week, their rating of financial difficulties due to caring, satisfaction with services, And we also then looked at those different phases of the COVID-19 restrictions. And finally, whether the survey was completed online or by paper. And if we're looking at the first column, B, the coefficients, and you're looking at those with stars next to them are those that are significant associations. So we found significant positive associations between social care related quality of life and self-rated health of the carer, and also the carer's satisfaction with their social care or with the social care support. So that's as we'd expect. Normally people with better health do report better quality of life, and also reassuringly satisfaction with services is related to social care related quality of life. And again, perhaps as we'd expect, we found that someone caring for someone with more severe impairments, living with the person, providing more than 50 hours of care per week were all associated with lower social care related quality of life and negative association. And also there was a negative association for financial difficulty due to caring. And again, in the paper which was written and then published December last year, I think this is an important finding, particularly a year on when we're looking at cost of living impacts and some of the challenges of, that people who are caring for a loved one face, and that interaction between financial difficulty and quality of life. And finally, two other things that I think were interesting from this is that there was no significant association between the carer's quality of life and the phases of COVID, which you could think, oh, that's a good thing. But then on the other hand, when we're looking at that really high profile of need, I'm just going to flip back. When you look at that really high profile of need, the question is this a good finding? And again, this is anecdotally or from qualitative evidence, but I think this helps illuminate what might be going on, is carers of people with dementia saying, well, the lockdowns and COVID didn't really make a difference because actually people were experiencing maybe more what my life is like anyway. So, and I think that's possibly part of what's going on here. And finally, we also looked at data collection mode, so online or by paper, and that was not significant either, which again is perhaps helpful information for us or for other people thinking of using these surveys for data collection, that actually mode doesn't seem to have a significant effect. So rather than a table with the proxy perspectives, just to give a few headlines, I looked at similar characteristics, both of the individual, caring situation, suitability of the home design, as I mentioned earlier, which is quite important. And we found slightly different patterns for the proxy and the proxy person. So thinking first of proxy rating, we found a lot of things that we'd expect to see. So there were positive associations, so better quality of life for people who said that their home design was good for their needs, better for those who were living with their carer, those receiving more than 50 hours of care per week. So again, that's reflecting the effort of family carers, and also the intensity of home care per week and use of other services. So again, that's maybe what we'd expect to see as people are supported. But we found negative associations for severe cognitive impairment, and also the introduction of the regional tier system in autumn 2020. So there was a dip in quality of life reported then. And then for the proxy person, we found this slightly different pattern. We found the significant negative associations for age, for ADLs, cognitive impairments. Again, what you'd perhaps expect to see. But interestingly, a slightly different pattern with the tier system. So what we found is in those later tiers, so reintroducing the tier system in 2020, then the third national lockdown, and to the end of the study, there were significant negative associations. And interestingly, for the proxy person rating, the intensity and type of care was not significant. And for both proxy ratings, completion by online or postal were not significant. So what can we draw from these findings? So a few kind of headline points to make. I think the key thing is just the high percentage of unmet social care related quality of life needs among the sample reflective of carers of people living with dementia in their own home. And again, that finding from carers' own quality of life is that experiencing financial difficulties being a particular factor associated with poorer quality of life outcomes, as well as intensive caring more than 50 hours per week and poor health. And again, that satisfaction of the carer with their social care is associated with better outcomes. And I think this really reinforces certainly what is there in policy and legislation around the need to consider family carers in thinking around social care. So thinking of the whole family, thinking of the carer when putting support in place. And of course, we all know from media and our own research some of the challenges of doing that, but I think this work emphasises why it's important. And in terms of the findings for the COVID-19 restrictions, again, this was not the point of the study, but because we collected data in this time, it gives a little bit of a snapshot, some interesting data to look at. And what we found that there was no significant association with the different phases of restrictions for carers' quality of life. And I mentioned earlier perhaps a hypothesis of why that might be, and perhaps it's the low quality of life to start with, and the way in which the restrictions weren't really further restricting lives that are already quite restricted. But also this negative association of people living with dementia's quality of life proxy reported, whether that was proxy at a particular point in time with that reintroduction of restrictions, or this more pattern of more cumulative effects for the proxy person ratings. And again, a caveat here, because we were not following people longitudinally. This was a cross-sectional study, but still provides to a bigger picture of other studies of some of the impacts of COVID on people's quality of life, which I think is increasingly being recognised. The way in which restrictions to protect people from COVID are important, but also the quality of life impacts are important to consider as well. So that's the end of that presentation. I'll just